What do you think? What do you
I
think?
apologize, I forgot to start recording earlier. So repeat everything you said, Fred. No, 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 no.
I'm going to make a judgment. Oh,
Fred, at some point, not to complicate things more, but
no, too
could
complicated.
you talk a little bit about the levels of consciousness? It seems to me that George, has said, that you get stuck maybe in subjectivism, but you're saying you try to plumb the depths of the facts and then at some point decide. But the levels of consciousness, it seems to me, would either be more refined or not. But
That's
again,
true. So let me say something about consciousness. Consciousness means present, you're present to yourself. Like when you're going to sneeze, usually just before you sneeze, you're aware you're going to sneeze. That's consciousness, presence to yourself. But what we're really talking about is presence to yourself as present to the world. So besides consciousness, you have intentionality.
That's the word I was about to say. I think intentionality is at the heart.
Of George's question.
Yes.
In other words, consciousness isn't just stuck in yourself as a monad, although people are that way. Consciousness spontaneously is extroverted. So a little kid, when he wants to ask about something, is likely to point at it so that you know what he's talking about. And that's what our consciousness does. It's more or less focal. It's more or less something you're explicitly aware of, what you're thinking about, what you're talking about. But there's the other side of consciousness that's tacit. In other words, it isn't something that you really have considered explicitly. The phenomenologists use the word thematize. So I used an example of thematization in our discussion about law. That when a person comes to a lawyer, their problem really requires the lawyer to thematize the case, the situation, in legal terms. And they know that they were aware that they needed that help, but they weren't capable of solving the issue. So you had to put it in the context of that. And so also when kids ask questions in catechism, they really have the question. And when they ask the question, it's coming from somewhere, and maybe the somewhere it's coming from already involves or judgment about what the issue is. And part of the big problem will be overcoming the caricatures that are already built up in their tacit awareness. And so you have these two sides of consciousness. BC used to have, it used to be part of the Perkins School for the Blind.
I'm not hearing you, Fred.
Fred, you're frozen.
You're frozen, Fred.
Indeed.
Okay.
he's gone now. What do you mean, Fred?
Well,
You know, this sounds a whole lot like Quid Quid Registrator. Remember
There
that?
he is.
Yeah,
Yeah,
here he comes.
Hi, Fred.
Fred, you're back.
You're
You're
muted.
But
Yeah.
you're muted.
Thank you.
There you go.
So what you would have is people who were going blind,
Ah,
and they would be walking with somebody, and they had a cane or a stick kind of with a red bottom on it, maybe giving the degree of their blindness already. And when you start off with the cane or the stick, your attention is on the stick, but the whole thing they're trying to learn is no longer thinking directly about the stick, but about reading the world through the stick. Making something explicitly, something you're now explicitly aware of, as opposed to only tacitly aware of it. And so that's a big shift. So that's a feature of consciousness that's often not thought of. And so there's a way of thinking about consciousness which identifies it with explicit perception. So I'm driving on my way to Oklahoma, and I'm going through a section where there's road work going on. And I'm not really paying attention to the road work. And I'm going way over the number of miles I'm allowed. And all of a sudden, the lights of the policemen are behind me.
yeah,
And I look at my speedometer and realize, uh-oh.
yeah,
Not only going beyond what the 45 miles per hour required, but I'm probably going 70, you see. But I wasn't explicitly aware of it. I didn't perceive that and explicitly, but the cop sure did. And so I got my ticket. The other example I use is learning to ride your bike. We all went through that experience. When you're learning to ride your bike, you're concentrated on keeping your balance on that bike. You don't learn to ride your bike in a place where there's a lot of traffic. You are in a big playground or a place where there's an empty space that you can make mistakes on and so forth. Or there are benches that you can start off from and all those things. So, but eventually you can, in our example, for example, you can ride your bike through Harvard Square, which is a mess of traffic. And you're not thinking about your bike, you're thinking about the traffic and watching out for pedestrians and so forth. The shift from the explicit consciousness before of just your bike and balancing your bike and so forth, to what the kind of traffic or the kind of situation you're going through. So that's an important aspect. The other aspect of the tacit awareness, as I've already mentioned, is that through what Miller talks about as spontaneous intersubjectivity, we pick up a load of misconceptions or partial conceptions or misunderstandings of things, which we didn't intend to pick up, but they're there and they're affecting the kinds of questions we'll ask, how we'll frame our questions, and how we'll think about what are reliable data and what aren't. So for example, you have what I already mentioned, the constant changes of the CDC with regard to waiting for further data about a new question that's emerged, and then changing in terms of the data that does emerge, making the judgment that we have to do something different, like wear our masks indoors or whatever it might be, even though we have the vaccines. But just the fact that they change when a person says in an undifferentiated way to a person, Well, you have to follow the science. And they're thinking to themselves, oh yeah, which part of the science and so forth and so on. You see what I mean? They're not necessarily dumb, but they're operating in terms of, well, if it's science, then it has to stick. But we know from the example you mentioned about doctors saying, after 5 years, I realized that almost everything I was taught was irrelevant. Science isn't something that is fixed. It's an evolving thing. And it has to do possibly with the overwhelming thing about Lonergan's whole approach. And this has to do with Granville's presentation to us about process, philosophy, and theology. What's in process is the creation. What's created, not God, not the creator. God's not in process, and it doesn't take anything away from God's dynamism, you could say, because God is infinite, and God foresees and understands and judges and decides what to do. And what we understand that God did because of revelation is he created the universe. But as we know from the Declaration of Independence, that whole thing about people have inalienable rights because because these rights were given to them by nature and nature's God. Well, that means they really couldn't know about creation without revelation. But they realized that as a deist who's not believing revelation, it stands to reason that probably the world didn't just evolve by itself. A person could ask, well, yeah, there's the Big Bang, but what's the reasonableness of the bang? What's the intelligibility of the bang? And so forth. You see what I'm trying to say?
Mhm.
So a deist can affirm that there is such a thing as creation, and so much of our own civic life is based on that premise, that people actually do have rights, and they're not something that that can be neglected or not taken into account in any given situation. Now, when we talk about that, as Abraham Lincoln did in the Gettysburg Address, he says that these soldiers who had died at Gettysburg did so because they were dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Well, that proposition and that dedication was a matter of belief. So 90% of what anybody thinks they know by believing it.
By the what?
By believing it.
By believing.
And so that's the possibility of living together. And when we no longer share fundamental beliefs, we're sort of getting to be up a creek without a paddle. And so now what is belief? Belief really is a matter of judgment. But it's an interesting matter of judgment because what judgment does is assent to the fact that something is so. But creation is something that you could prove by science. It's not something that the Greeks talked about. The final cause of Aristotle's metaphysics was not transcendent. Whereas we believe that God exists who is beyond contingency and necessity, transcendent in a very strict sense. But why do we think that? Only because of revelation. It's a belief. So in the case of supernatural revelation, what we do is we hold as true things that we couldn't have figured out by ourselves. And we depend upon people or the way it's usually stated, God himself, who reveals to us. We make a judgment of that they know what they're talking about, whether it's about climate change or whether Biden is to be blamed for the situation in Afghanistan and so forth. We depend on the knowledge and then the credibility of the people who tell us these things. And so on that basis, because we want to live by what's true, but the truth we're going to live by is something that we assent to, not because we ourselves could gather the evidence and come to the virtually unconditioned, but because we couldn't. That would be true about all kinds of things that are finite as well as revealed.
Fred, could we pause here and expand on what you're saying? Because what I'm thinking about belief and what you're saying about the people we believe in, it seems like today there's kind of a crisis of assessing beliefs and questioning the sources of what we thought was valid. For example, let's say history books. It seemed like there's an extreme sense of, wow, if we read a history book, it was taught to us as if this is it, when the history book may have been 20% of what was going on, you know what I mean, in the world or whatever, from a certain perspective. And we're particularly aware of it nowadays with this misinformation. What we call misinformation, other people are calling information, right? And they're believing, the QAnon people are believing that's so, and other people believe it's not so. So people are going through an assessing of beliefs. So for example, myself, I might say, well, I'm assessing where the heck did infallibility come from? Or when did the church start using the word Catholic? Or what is there about contraception in the scriptures, and why was that added on? And who were the people doing it? And when we see how people today come up with their personal biases and come up with something that they put out there as a truth, then I'm going back and I'm saying, yeah, I used to thought all this was done, but now the people that did this were all men selecting these books that were the canon. You know what I mean? You can really get into questioning the basis of beliefs that I took for granted before, because I grew up in a tribe and a group of immigrant believers, but now I'm at a different place. I'm 50 years past that,
Could
That all?
could I interrupt for just a second?
Please. Yeah.
Are we then, George? It seems to me that there's a spectrum of truth, or a spectrum of subjectivity here, and I think can't remember his name. Mark Miller says that the only thing that he thinks, or that Lonergan thought was absolute, is mathematics and revelation. But we know that there are only certain things that are clear with respect to revelation that we've been told are absolute truths, the creed. But everything else has some form of subjectivity, then, it sounds like. It gets less and less subjective, but it appears that we can always find more out. And
Well, that's the thing that.
Wait, Fred, just a second. May I add to that? Because I've been spoiling to ask some version of this question for 15 minutes. To me, this is a source of extreme pessimism. You know, and it's worse even, I think. Like George, the examples you gave, you know, a male bias in theology. It seems to me that something like that, or where did the contraception thing come from? It's fairly easy to demonstrate that stuff, it seems to me. And we may have deep-seated biases that, you know, my brother-in-law once said, oh, isn't it interesting? You know, people talk about African theology and Asian theology and feminist theology, but the theology of the scholastics and the mainstream theology of the church, well, that's just theology. You know, is not to be qualified or described in any way. It's not European theology. No, that's theology. But it seems to be that kind of bias is fairly easy to demonstrate and deal with. You know, we could trace it through and all of that. What's driving me insane is the research that's come out in the last X years, I mean, say 30 years, that shows that, for example, you can take a belief that somebody holds and bury it with every objective fact known to the cosmos. And the result is that person comes out more adamant and committed to that belief that has just been demolished and destroyed by every canon of knowledge that exists. And people just dig in and adhere to it all the more. As a lawyer, you know, that just drives me crazy thinking I'm standing in front of a jury and, okay, now here are the facts that establish X, you know, fact 1, fact 2, fact 3, fact 4. Okay, now we're going to go to Y. And there will be people sitting there saying, bullshit. You know, and I don't know what to do with that. And it truly frightens me, like the vaccine thing. You know, the people that are saying, I need more data. Well, that person has had a smallpox shot. That person has had a flu shot. That person has had a measles shot, a mumps shot, a rubella shot. But they need more evidence for, you know, despite the fact that hundreds of millions of people have been inoculated against COVID-19, hundreds of millions, but that's not good enough. We need more evidence. Bullshit. No, you don't, you idiot. What the fuck are you talking about? And it just drives me crazy, as you might observe.
Yes, I observed, George.
George, admit
You
it,
did.
George, admit it. The earth is flat.
Uh,
Without
Well-
infallibility.
I feel better now.
Well,
This really torments me.
yeah, well,
For
George, let
lack of a
me toss this out to the whole group here. You know how our bodies have different organs and functions and everything, if you map the body out, the silhouette?
Yeah, sure.
You know, so what if in the brain there are different sections, and one is the thinking process that you're talking about and assuming when you're laying, what if there's another part of the brain that these other people are in that they can't get out of? Yeah, that they can't get out of that, and the corresponding patterns of guiding their life by, they're stuck there. It's like they're in a piece behind their left ear, you know, where people don't think, and then there's another, they can't quite get out into the rational. What's going on there? I mean, I'm just trying to use a metaphor. What is going on? Is it something physical?
Can I volunteer for a minute? You're looking at
And John, I just want to
50
say one
years
thing.
of sales business.
Yeah,
And the core in my personal experience and my training is trust, not facts, trust. If I can establish my credibility, then what I present is in a format that George Varick can now go to those places in your brain. But if you don't trust me, if I haven't established my credentials in some way with you, I'm not likely to get there. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And John, your cap helps. You know, that cap gives you an authority. That,
I still have hair, but just not as much.
no, I think
Uh,
you're, no, I think what you're saying is important. Trust. Yeah.
Could
No,
I
I also think that Jonathan Haidt's moral
Mhm.
foundations theory says something to this, that for whatever reason, different people are seemingly pre-programmed to process their reality in different ways, which seem to be well identified, fairly well identified by those 5 categories of moral foundations. I just say that without further comment. I'm not too sure where to take that, but that
Well,
there
it really causes people to filter facts through a
Yeah.
value system, you know. But like, I was thinking the Lincoln Douglas debates. Okay, these two guys went up and down Illinois when Douglas beat Lincoln for the Senate in 1858, I guess. And Lincoln Douglas debates, you know, and they would draw huge crowds and people would listen. And then I always thought be swayed by one speaker or the other, you know, but I guess not, or else human cognition has changed since 1858. You know, the great speeches of history, the Cooperstown addresses of Lincoln, I don't know. I mean, where FDR in 1940 argued that this country had to arm itself, you know, shit was going to happen. And he persuaded a lot of people. He didn't persuade everybody, but he persuaded a lot. Could that happen today, that people are subject to persuasion? And Fred, what does that do to Lonergan's ways of knowing, you know, of his, for want of a better word, epistemology?
yeah, it's really cognitional theory.
Okay.
Epistemology is asked too quickly. It's how do we know we know? If you already doubt that you know, you're not going to find out. But if
Well,
you,
I know. It's just all those other people.
but yeah, yeah. Well, they have the same problem, I think. But at any rate, you have to ask the question, what am I doing when I think I'm knowing? In order to ask adequately, why is that knowing? And in a way, that's what a lot of the questions that have been raised here are. Is it just subjective or not, and so forth. But furthermore, that thing about trust is absolutely, when he talks about credentials, it's this nonce word that we figured out, credibility and credentity, meaning you got the credentials, but don't talk to a MAGA guy in that hat. So, but at any rate, about infallibility, one of my fellow theologians from Germany, Hermann Pottmeyer, wrote a book about infallibility. And this is a good thing to realize. So he went into the data. Where did that idea come from? And what was the historical context in which it arose? Well, the historical context in which it arose was nationalism, and also the getting rid of the papal states, its own little nation. So where did that leave the Pope? Without any real basis for a kind of legitimacy. Meanwhile, at the same time, there were conservatives one in France especially named de Maistre, and another one in Spain called Donoso Cortés, who were tremendously influenced by Hobbes. And Hobbes didn't have a theory of truth. In fact, his theory was what number one is the will and willpower. And so the intellect is really a tool of the will, rather than it follows what intelligence and reasonableness affirm. And so Hobbes, in the Latin edition of his Leviathan, his most important book on political theology, he could write this awful sentence: auctoritas non veritas rules. It decides, it rules. And that's a voluntarist notion of the will. And it's all based on power. Who has the monopoly of power? So de Maistre and Cortés really gave the impetus to thinking about infallibility as a claim the Pope could make for himself in order to regain some of the stature that was lost when he was no longer the head of temporal territory, except for the small Vatican that's there now. So that's a background to it, and that certainly relativizes the idea of infallibility.
Yeah.
It does.
I remember very well someone telling me, a student of Rahner who was close to Rahner, said that after the first wonderful encyclical by JP2, Rahner wrote to him and said, this was a beautiful and wonderful encyclical. Don't write anymore.
Because
Because as people interpreted that, JP2 thought he was infallible.
I said,
You're gonna,
He drank the Kool-Aid.
yeah, he did.
At any rate, coming back to the problem of judgment.
Could I throw a little footnote into that JP2 thinking he was infallible? Because I think there was at least one or two instances, one being Mary the Mediatrix of all graces,
yeah.
that Ratzinger put the brake on his quest for infallibility. Do you know anything about that? The other may be he couched the abortion statement in Evangelium Vitae in terms just falling short of the legal, shall we say, canonical requirements for an infallible statement.
Also female priests.
Female priest.
Yeah. But that Ratzinger was the one who kind of said, don't take that final step.
Yes, that's what I understand too.
Yeah,
The moral there is take your friends where you find them.
I guess so.
And power being a huge factor in definition of truth.
Which of course, Lord Acton said about Pius IX.
Mhm.
Auctoritas,
So I guess if you
auctoritas non veritas facit legem.
Mhm.
Yeah.
so what if you take this all the way back to whoever wrote the Adam and Eve story, and could that have been a JP2 of his time, writing a male dominating story about the source of evil? And could you go back and try to reassess that and say, wait a minute, maybe that's something similar to what JP2 was going to do when he was flinging around this infallible wand. And so we get all these stories that we're living with as if they were so, when they can be questioned now by feminist theologians.
Well, I think Augustine said something true when he said, Adam was tempted in Eve, and Eve sinned in Adam. So it wasn't just the one person at fault.
Right.
It was a group project.
Think.
Takes
Yeah.
two to tango.
Yeah, but human beings have certainly taken the tempting part, and those are the women who get stoned when there's been.
Oh, I agree.
Everybody's frozen now.
I
Yeah.
agree with that.
Hello?
I don't think
Hello?
you can.
No, we're not.
I don't think you can judge people anachronistically. Impose our insights into morality the same way on people so many years before. That doesn't seem like a fair way of doing exegesis or interpreting the scripture to me.
Yeah, what would a feminist theologian do with the story, George?
What would a what?
Feminist theologian do with the story of the fall? I mean,
I don't know. They might come up with a totally different view of what sin is, or I'm not exactly sure, not being one, but I think there's, for example, I'm questioning, what I grew up with is that death is the wages of sin, and I no longer believe that. I don't see it that way. I see a more Buddhist way. Maybe the fall, maybe the pain that death brings us, maybe that has to do with the fall, but I don't see death being the wages of sin anymore. I see it as part of our being a composite being. I mean, animals have not sinned and they die. Everything else that's more advanced in stones and trees and so forth, don't die. But we're the most advanced, but we die. We fall apart. We disintegrate. And so I see that as part of nature, so to speak. That's just the way we're made.
Well,
so-
isn't death, George? Well, I ought not to do this. John Henry Newman said, if there's a God, my recollection is, no, because there is a God, there has to have occurred a primordial catastrophe that got us to where we are. And I don't think the wages of sin are death. I think the wages, and now I'm off, of this primordial catastrophe is our condition that's weakened and clouded and not, everything that we do is contingent. I mean, our death is contingent on what we do. We're there, and Jesus came to fix that. But I guess he didn't change it enough, except that we cannot die. He said, if we follow him, we just transition from one dimension to another. Did that make any sense at all?
Well, except a lot of people don't even know Jesus. So it's got to be, to me, it's got to be something different than that too, because unless you want to, whether a person comes into touch with Jesus and his teachings is a probability thing, right? It's not something that everybody has an equal chance at.
I think that's right, but that's where I start getting into analogies. And anyway,
Yeah.
I don't want to get far
Yeah.
from.
well,
Yeah.
The creation story changed the creation stories that preceded it in Babylon and so forth, where you have a question. There is evil in the world.
Mhm.
Right.
So what's the cause of it? How did we get so screwed up? They're trying to answer that question. in the
Right.
second creation story. So the first one is, why is there something and not nothing? And that's really back in the 9th century, after the Jews have been going for quite a long time. And the Jews don't think of the second creation story as really the origin of sin. They believe that sin, most of them believe that sin really originated with the killing of Abel by Cain. So the thing is wide open, but what that story did do was get it out of the fact that there's this impersonal battle between an evil spirit and a good spirit that's playing itself out in human terms. And so that was a form of demythologization of the Babylonian way of thinking about creation. And I think that was a great contribution. The other thing that, say, Martin Buber said about the second creation story and the being banished from the Garden of Eden and being condemned to death is, think of the overpopulation problem we've had if no one who ever was born didn't die.
Yeah.
So
Right.
it's more wide open. The way of thinking about it is more wide open than just pointing the finger at stupid things. Is the way I think about it.
I think there's another element there that we need to appreciate, and that is all of these stories are not meant to be historical accounts. They are literary, and we have to see them in terms of metaphor and tease out meaning from what is essentially metaphorical rather than literal. And
That was the.
it's tremendously unsatisfying to the person who wants to have who just wants to tell it like it is.
Certainty.
Yeah, George, that was the point of my rhetorical question about what difference would the feminist theologians make. In other words, we have a world that groans under the weight of at least sin, if not a primal catastrophe, at least sin. And, we've got this cute little story, or not so cute little story, that that the serpent causes Eve to give in, and then she causes Adam to give in. But I don't get out of that story anything that disparages females, personally, and I don't think females need defending for the fall. Now I guess maybe in the history of Christianity, there have
Right.
been
Yeah.
times and places where that would have been so. But so that was the point of my question. In other words, so what? As to how it all got started. There's obviously a need for redemption here.
Yeah, and it seems to me the key thing in the conversation between the serpent and Eve was, first of all, how he lures her into the conversation. Did he say you couldn't eat any of the fruit of any of the trees in the Garden of Eden? And then she corrects him and says, no, he just said we couldn't eat of this one. And then the serpent says in Genesis 3:7, I think, if you eat of it, you shall be as gods. And so one of the thing is, so there's the symbolism of a limit. You can't eat one thing. But just think of yourself as a little kid when your parents gave you limits, especially when you got into teenage. The question would be, well, all the other kids are doing this. Why are you limiting me? And it turns into
Yeah.
a power battle. and which is a losing battle, of course. But that thing of envy, and the centrality of envy in the relationship to all sinful relationships, I think is crucial. And we know that's not restricted to females.
Right,
Mm.
yeah,
And that's more important than the fact that it happened to be a female. And just in what is, as Tom just brought out, when Augustine couldn't stand the scriptures, but when he went to Milan, he finally heard Ambrose say, don't read the scriptures literally. They're to be read symbolically. So you have creationists today saying, oh no, the world was created in 1500 or 15, whatever years ago, in 7 days. But if you read the text, there was no sun until the 4th day. But there was light without a sun. So it's obviously not a literal day.
yeah,
It's such a simple thing to see.
Yeah.
But and this goes back to the thing of what George Brooke was saying about the person who says bullshit. It's not, I think it's not a matter of what part of the brain are they operating out of. It has to do with one form or another of bias. And the form that's really bothering us today is a combination of common sense bias, which is the idea that we can solve everything without any kind of theory or science. And the other thing is group bias. Who are your friends? Who are your friends that you talk about the conspiracy theories with? And why did you fall for the manipulation of Trump, who knew that you would have a lot of resentment for the Democrats who changed the Democratic Party from being for the people to being virtually Republican under the Clinton, getting rid of the Glass-Steagall Act and so forth, liberating the banks from being what they should be to being money-making thing, making money with money rather than making money with investments in new production and so forth. So of course, all those people left out would have hated Hillary Clinton's guts, and with the other problems they have with bias in terms of racism and so forth. Trump was a master at playing on all those desires and fears. So they trust him. Can you imagine trusting him?
so that
Right.
kind of figures in with Hobbes's thing, right?
Exactly. So anyway, I don't know whether we talked about judgment enough, but I think
I think,
just to say something about I think the structure of the book is that we're talking about understanding the cosmos as many layered, and that the layers are interdependent. And as you ascend through emergent probability from physical to chemical to botanical to zoological to animal psychology, the dog waking up with a bad dream after sleeping in front of the fireplace, going around in circles. I remember that very well. And then to human consciousness, which is intelligent, which has the light, luminosity, to desire to know everything about everything and to be united with God. But not everybody understands it or reads it that way, but they're using their curiosity in some sense, their desire to know by wanting to prove that that's false. But nevertheless, Aristotle from the very beginning said human beings by nature desire to know. And so above in each layer that I named, there's more freedom, more openness, more possibilities opened up. And these all interplay with each other in the form of the intelligibility that Lonergan calls emergent probability of emergence and chances of survival. So that's important. The other thing that he wants to emphasize is the fact that history is not just a story of progress, but it's the story of progress, decline, and redemption.
Mhm.
And when you get into the problem of evil, from the Christian point of view, the solution is God's doing, fundamentally. And so, and the doing has to do with created participations in the Trinity. So Christ Jesus has the fullness of grace, and Christ Jesus lives a gracious life of self-sacrifice, taken, broken, given away. And part of the giving away has to do with the gift of the Holy Spirit. And that gift of the Holy Spirit is what the tradition calls sanctifying grace. And what that does is, to some extent, it's the way Thomas Aquinas talked about it, is it moves the will, meaning the will of the end, that for the sake of which you do everything, without the will actually choosing it. And it does it by what can be said to be falling in love with God. It's a gift. And the falling in love with God then changes the possibilities of living in accord with the light, asking and answering questions, correcting yourself throughout history. But the finality of it is what the tradition calls the beatific vision. And the beatific vision is a created participation in the relation of the Son to the Father. And that's the culmination of our participation in the graciousness of the Trinity. And so we have to think about progress, what constitutes progress, what constitutes decline, and what constitutes redemption. And that's what Lonergan set out to do. So chapter 2 talks about what we talked about first, was less the levels of consciousness than about the fact of understanding, of asking and answering questions in relation to things we see, hear, smell, taste, and touch, and above all, imagine. So unlike the divine or angelic intellect, we are conditioned by space and time extrinsically. Everything else but human beings, so far as we know, we can't leave out. There's a lot of evidence to show that animals probably have more intelligence than we really believe. But nevertheless, we have this degree of freedom and this infinite potency to understand. And the infinite potency is the ground of our possibility of sinning. And the nice thing about animals, so far as we know, is they don't sin, but we sure as hell do. And so this, in order for the intellect to work, what it means to be conditioned by space and time in relation to understanding is that insights occur with regard to questions that illuminate or that arise from sensible data, and that we use the sensible data to create images out of. And insights are into images. So think of all of you who are so steeped in different literatures, and how much literature has helped you to understand yourself and others by presenting to us either literatures and films and plays, sensible images, a drama with a plot, a set of things that people do and suffer that's heading toward a point. Unless you're talking about the theater of the absurd or so. And that's how we get our bearings. And the way we start to get our bearings is not through theology and through theory, but through stories. And that's the meaning of the word myth. And the myths never really lose their validity, but they can be understood with the help of moving sometimes to the world of theory by asking questions. And that's just how in Catholic theology we got into that. When Arius, you had all kinds of ways of thinking about Christ, but when Arius used the fundamental distinction from the Old Testament, either God or a creature. And so most ways of thinking about God, Jesus running up to Arius were subordinationist. So Jesus was God, but a little less than God. And Arius was more differentiated, and he said, no, if you're a little less, then you're a creature. Well, then how do you understand the divinity of Christ? And that was the problem that was solved by reading the scriptures with the control of logic. And the answer to the question, according to Athanasius of Alexandria, was in the scriptures, everything that was said of the Father is said of the Son, except the name Father. So he crosses the line. He crosses the line over to divinity. But there's a lot of reasons why that happened. In the background, you have Ignatius, the bishop who was on his way to his letters written on the way to martyrdom,
Rome.
pleading not to be saved from martyrdom by people.
Mm-hmm.
Because of his desire to be like Christ in every respect. He made the statement in one of his letters, if Jesus isn't divine, then we're not saved. Meanwhile, you have the Eucharist, and the Eucharist really thinks of, it's not just any kind of worship, but there is what they call latria, the kind of adoration that's only given to God. But this was not a theory, this was a practice. So you had all kinds of things backing up on the common sense level, on the experiential level, the notion that Jesus is divine. Now, so they got into the world of theory. Then you had the question about, well, how could he be both divine and human? And there are all ways of talking about that. And that got resolved at the Council of Chalcedon once again by lining up all the affirmations about Jesus that have to do with his being human and all the affirmations that have to do with his being divine, only possible for something divine, someone divine, and saying, well, we have all these things, and the condition of the possibility for the divine things is being divine, divine nature, and all the possibilities for being human is a human nature. And since Jesus is a person, you have one person and two natures. But it was using logical controls of meaning in order to come up with that. And so now we're stuck with that tradition. We believe it, the creeds, apostolic and Nicene, Constantinopolitan creed that Ned was talking about, are uttering those statements that were highly theoretical, but in the context of worship, they have a symbolic meaning, much more. So it's interesting that the creeds originally were called symbols. And that was, in a way, the qualifying thing for being able to participate in the highest forms of worship in the Eucharist and so forth. So there's a trail of questions leading to these differentiations. So that's a big problem or issue that he's trying to deal with, differentiations of consciousness.
Fred, is there in Lonergan's cognitional theory a place for not power, but authority? In other words, we obviously, as he says, and we're told by so many that we are constantly wanting to understand. Okay, faith seeking understanding, but even more than that, we're just made that way, as you had just mentioned or reminded us. But the capacity of each one of us to search and find is limited until we become 6, like we're here. And then through the dynamic of our minds and spirits, we are able to see things that we wouldn't otherwise if we're open to it. And then there comes a time or a place or a place where I am not able to penetrate. So don't we have to have at some point, in order to live with some modicum of peace, an authority that we trust?
Sure.
That we finally say, this person is, to my lights, holy, humble, and able to give me some direction.
But who is that? Is that Raymond Burke? Is that Bishop Olmsted? Is that Gomez? Is that this payaso in Colorado?
Or is it McCarrick? Is it McCarrick?
Yeah,
Right.
it's
Oh,
a problem.
it's not. But that's the
I'll be
problem.
right back.
That's the problem with the church, that it really took the Hobbesian notion of power and ran with it. But the original meaning of authority is what you have as a lawyer, or some of us had it, Tom has as a priest, an authority that's mainly grounded in knowledge, not will, not power.
Mhm.
That's constantly misunderstood by people who rise in the ranks of the church because they're socialized and acculturated into a power culture. So I remember, this is a funny, stupid story maybe. We started a program in DC called Perspectives in Western Civilization. And it's a wonderful program where students read the classics, ancient and modern. And some of them go on to more specialized classes having to do with science and social sciences, and also the arts and so forth. And so Sean McEvenew, who is a scripture scholar, but at Loyola University in Montreal, Loyola University in Montreal was going to join a Methodist university. It's like BC joining BU. And it was going to be absorbed into it, but there were going to be big changes. And he wanted to set up what he called the Lonergan College. And so he called together people. And since I had been instrumental in starting that Perspectives program, he called me. But he called a Jesuit, a laicized Jesuit who became a provost or something like that at a Western state university. And I thought we were going to talk about the liberal arts and so forth and so on. So we started our talk at, say, 9:30. And by 4:30, all we talked about was who was making the transfers of money in order to get this thing started. I must say I was a little crestfallen. I had to go home in a huge snowstorm. My flight would be delayed and I wouldn't get back forever. But what was it for? Basically, nothing. I mean, in terms of my thing, I'm sure they might have settled something, but that's the ball game. Who makes the transfers? And that's where authority for whatever happens in the university is going to occur. And so remember in the earlier days of our conversations with me anyway, there was a lot of talk about what Ben Hawks would allow or not allow, because he makes the transfers.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't help but think that, you know, the question of authority in relationship to myself as an individual or any person as an individual, that a criterion that I have to use, and maybe in looking at myself, but as an authority figure in some instances, but in looking at whom do I recognize as authority, a particular element of maybe a central element of how do I judge, how do I determine whom I will accept as an authority, to me has to be humility. Do they exercise authority with a degree of realistic assessment to their own limitations, and therefore exercise authority with appropriate firmness, but also with a certain appropriate tentativeness that, yeah, I may be wrong.
Right. Well, that's the thing about knowledge. If a person really has knowledge, they also have a pretty clear notion of how much they don't know.
Yeah.
They're not going to be haughty about these things.
Yeah.
And so they're going to do what Ned did when he started as a corporation lawyer, being lost, but then getting into conversations and finding out what it really was all about. And so a lot of his thing was asking questions and listening.
Mhm.
But eventually he became a reliable corporate lawyer because he went through, he knew from the beginning, he told us in his recounting of this, he went to that thing and he knew a lot about what he'd been taught in school and so forth and so on, but he felt lost. So instead of acting like an authority, he tried to find out, well, what's the real situation, which I'm supposed to have an authority in, and so forth. You see what I'm trying to say? And it was such a beautiful story about a person who was going to gain real authority. And I feel like that's true of what George did with respect to his vocation. That's Susanna. Oh, push that thing over, the white thing, push the white thing over, slide it over.
And then Fred, just to piggyback, and then Ned, you said that when you went to give talks, people expected somebody that would kind of be authoritarian.
Yeah.
But you went and tried to work things out collaboratively.
Yes.
So that kind of fits in with Tom, what you're saying about humility. In other words, you're not going in as the answer man, right?
Mhm.
Well, but I agree with what Tom said. I agree with what Ned said. I agree with that. But authority, I mean, these are kind of our 21st century American glosses onto the concept of authority. You know, we want somebody nice to be carrying a shepherd's staff and wearing a mitre. And is that what it's meant over the centuries? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Cardinal Newman, one of the reasons he became a Roman Catholic, leaving the Oxford movement, etc., was because the Catholic Church, darn it, speaks with authority. Even if I don't agree with it when it does, you know, with Pius IX and infallibility, infallibility. What do we do about that? I mean, authorities, does it have to be soft and nice?
No,
Or it's not, right? You often.
it needs to be
It
what
has-
Tom
It has to be authentic.
yes. there you
Yeah.
go.
But I'll bet the Archbishop Aquila in Denver thinks he's just as authentic could be, you know, and what's his name, Nauman in Kansas City is outraged that Joe Biden is saying, well, I'm a serious Catholic. And Nauman is saying, what are you talking about? That's not your call to make. I'll tell you if you're a real Catholic. I'm a bishop, you know, and I mean, how do we have authority that isn't tyranny or is it stupidity or I don't know. You know,
Well, are you talking from the viewpoint of we who are under authority? I think from the 80s, there was something called I don't know if I have the right phrase, but a crap detector. You know, in other words, you sense by intuition and sizing things up that, no, this is not the authority I'm going to follow versus.
I think it's a bullshit detector.
Yeah, okay, bullshit. That's
Yeah, I mean, how many of us? I mean, I cannot think of anybody in the American hierarchy that I view as having authority over me.
Well, I think-
Francis, I would say, yeah. If he said George jump, I may not say how high, but I'd at least get off the ground, you know. But because I really respect Francis. But
I think that's a healthy sign, George.
yeah,
You're a health.
But Ned's point, I think, is sort of valid. The church should have authority. I mean, and ought to, it does. But I can't. I mean, I can't think of one person in the American church. Maybe my brother-in-law, but he just retired, and that he had the criterion of humility in his use of authority.
I mean, there's some sense,
Soul. Could you
you know,
Ned?
isn't there some sense of an authority that I would follow, that this person has some regard for my well-being? That,
Sure.
uh, I'm thinking of an analogy coming from the Bay Area where the Golden State Warriors had super basketball teams. Steve Kerr, I think, is a good example of authority, and he's a guy that took his what's that he had in his hand, and he broke it because he was upset at what the team was doing. But his whole use of authority is to bring out the best in the team and to create teamwork and to deal with egos and have people participate. And that's the type of coach he is. And so
George,
to me, that's a good,
I
apart
just
from the
thought this
Woody
up.
Hayes, then there's a Woody Hayes guy, or the guy that would hit people if they weren't doing up to snuff. And you read about these gymnastic coaches that would shame young girls because of they were too fat or that they weren't doing well. So that's a misuse of authority, but they held it for quite a few years.
Take the Tom Selleck character on that Top Show, the name of which I can't think of.
Blue blood.
Huh?
Blue
Blue
blood.
Bloods. If I were a cop on that force and that guy were my head cop, I would follow him into the jaws of hell. I really would. There is a general. I mean, there is a guy. We don't grow bishops like that. I don't think too often.
So you're talking,
Bishop Charles Buswell from Colorado, Pueblo, was
Yeah.
a real.
Yeah, there were a few in those days.
We sometimes talk about Vatican II bishops. And some of them were the salt of the earth, I think.
Yeah.
One
Yeah.
example of a different.
Quinn.
McElroy in San Diego still seems to be one.
Yeah, Quinn was at San
Quinn definitely
Francisco.
was, yeah.
Yeah.
Let me interject here. One of the things that I have been very fascinated with for a good number of years. I don't know music, but I love classical music and I love finding out about what makes performers tick. And, one of the things that makes a good performer a great performer is their combination of knowledge and total respect for the score, what the composer put there, and then their own freedom and individuality of interpreting that. And you have, performers that are not very good because they are simply glued to the score. You have other performers who are not very good because they do whatever the hell they want with it. And so there's a combination, there's a relationship there. And then the second thing, one of the greatest sort of musical performers I find is the conductor who doesn't really seem to do anything except wave a stick. And yet that conductor has to play the orchestra with its individual personalities and people and varieties of skills, and at the same time create a unified whole coherent with his or her own vision of what that score, what the composer intended in the performance of that score. And I remember being friends when I was at where you go, George, St. Charles, being friends with Paul Salamunovich.
Mhm.
And I asked him basically about, how do you do it? And he says, the first thing you have to do is use your authority, if you will, to inspire your singers to listen to one another. That whatever they they need to have the skills to interpret the score, to read the score, to follow an interpretation, but they need first and foremost to listen to one another. And I thought, yeah, there is one dimension of authority that I think is, I'd never thought of.
I thought of another example of authority. I remember before I left for Rome, I met a person when I could still speak a little bit of Spanish, who was in the parish wherever Terry Halloran, was that his first name?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was, and I asked him, well, in my pidgin Spanish, how was he as a priest? And he said, his whole answer was this: "El habla." And I think that spoke volumes, what he meant by "el habla." Not just that he knew Spanish, but that whole background that comes from that culture stood out for him in a way that seemed authentic. And so whatever he said, he could hear in a way that from other priests he couldn't. And we've all had that experience.
Mhm.
Ones we can hear and the ones that we
I would
realize.
think if any of us were bishops, or we would spend time, or should, trying to think, okay, the crowd spoke of Jesus and said, he teaches as one having authority, not as the scribes and Pharisees. What's the difference? I'll bet, the scribes and Pharisees, correct me if were pretty clear, as depicted in the Gospels, about, where to dot your I and cross your T. But I guess they didn't carry the day compared to Jesus. What was the difference?
Well, I think, wouldn't it be that he spoke to their hearts?
Well,
He when he taught, insofar as there's some legitimacy to the Sermon on the Mount, he said he wasn't really leaving aside anything that was important to the scribes and Pharisees. Not one iota of the law do I want to get rid of. But he spoke to their heart, and he talked about not just following the law, but going beyond that in the sense of the Beatitudes. I think it just is it's who's speaking, isn't it?
Well, yeah.
And you certainly could have rabbis and scribes who are not just inauthentic, but hypocrisy is pretty easy to absorb.
Well, isn't the root of the term author, authority, author, what the source, the one from whom it comes?
That's right. That's
And in a sense, the scribes and the Pharisees were working on interpretation, getting the I's dotted and the T's crossed right. And Jesus was speaking from the source, of being in touch with, whether it's the inner source of humanity or the source of divinity from which the prescriptions of the law came. Okay, what's behind it? That's the source. It's more certainly touching their hearts, but on the other side of things, where he was speaking from, that was a source of authority. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, let me
Mhm.
toss out a Buddhist thing. Reading the stories of some of these, there's a number of, they call them Jubus, Jewish people who become Buddhists. And they talk about going over to Thailand or Indonesia or something, and they met somebody that had a presence, somebody that really attracted that person. And in doing some reading, contemporary reading about, by people who went over and then came back and then studied meditation. The amount of hours that these people would meditate, and the authors of a book are recommending meditating more. It kind of fits in with what you said, Fred, about somebody who's an attorney who maybe has gone to court thousands of times, and has taken some cases to the Supreme Court or whatever. There's something that develops within them that gives them some kind of presence to self, that somehow you just feel, you intuit it, and this person has something. And so I think that has something to do with it. The source, people speak with it. It's not just words, but they've lived it out. They've lived out a certain amount of what they're talking about.
I think that's absolutely right. But there's more to it.
Yeah, there is.
But there's the other side of what George Kirk was talking about. That it reminds me of a saying from Dorothy Parker. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him think.
Mm.
Mhm.
Mhm.
That makes us a whole bunch of us horses.
Well, I
Well-
wonder if it's the culture that's changed or the nature of authority that's changed. Herbert was a shirt-tail relative of Will Durant, and used to tell a story about how when Leo the 13th wrote, or maybe it was Pius X, but wrote an encyclical condemning Americanism, the bishop of some minor diocese in New Jersey decided in all of his splendid ignorance to fire Peter, Durant, from St. Peter's College, a Jesuit college in New Jersey somewhere. And it was stupid, Herbert thought. And, Durant could have been a brilliant champion of the church and instead was anything but, I guess. Well, I mean, that guy was using his authority, by golly, wasn't he? And what a punk. I don't know. I don't know what I'm trying to say exactly. So I'll shut up.
Thomas Aquinas said that the number of the stupid is infinite.
I always did like that guy. I never read him much, but I was impressed, Fred, to read that Lonergan spent 10 years studying, climbing the heights to Aquinas or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that was great for me to read too. And then just take Aquinas' stuff and fit it into and appropriate it, not to change it, but to infuse the modern, the secular with it, the good stuff that's there. Wow, yeah. That was a great introduction in that book. Anyway.
Could I, if you've noticed on the screen, I've had my hand up for quite some time because I didn't want to forget. I do have a question for Fred that is a bit tangential, even though it does launch from the whole stream of what we've been talking about. And that is, has any work been done on relating, drawing lines of connectedness, perhaps, with Lonergan's cognitive theory and brain science? In other words, every aspect of cognition depends on our brain and different parts of our brains for it to happen. Prior to developments of brain science in the last 75 to 100 years, including more recent stuff, you know, anything that we didn't know about our mental processes, we simply attributed to the soul and said, well, that, you know, that's the way the soul is. And it does seem that so much of the philosophical studies of cognition seem to relate to the soul, but don't seem to say a lot about how this is connected to brain function. And what came to my mind was, I think it was with regard to, was it attentiveness, attention, where you have to pay very active attention to learning something like riding a bicycle. And then you don't have to pay attention to that anymore in order to do it. You pay attention to the traffic. And those are two distinct parts of the brain that actually do that. You know, the learning part is one part, and I think it's in the brainstem, where the habitual non-cognitive functions that we have learned. reside.
Moby, quiet.
And, you know, this stuff about Alzheimer's, for example, you know, parts of your brain are functioning beautifully, but other parts that actually try to carry that function into into reality or into activity are not functioning. And anybody doing work on brain science from a, let's say, Lonergan perspective?
Not that I know of. But what I do know is that Lonergan believed that we are a compound of organism, psyche, and intelligence. And each one of those things is for the sake of the one above it.
Mhm.
So some of your dreams, which have to do with your psyche, disturb you, but it has to do with responses to maybe something you ate
Mhm.
or something you underwent or whatever. But so each of them conditions the other and is the condition of the possibility for the good operation of the other.
Mhm.
So that would, of course, include the brain as an organism.
Yeah. Now,
And
to me, that leads to another question, and that is, what are we to think of a disembodied soul, which will be the fate of all of us at some point in the future, for at least a time, and even whatever that time might mean? Is there consciousness in a disembodied soul? And can we say anything about that, or do we have to be, and this is kind of my position, do we have to be kind of agnostic about, we really don't know what a disembodied soul is, or whether it actually even can be? We talk about immortal soul as Catholic doctrine, but how, you know, what's it like to be a disembodied soul?
Well,
Is, I guess, a question that we, you know, can't help but ask.
sure, but Thomas Aquinas did ask that question.
Mhm.
He said that a disembodied soul is not fully a person,
it's not fully what?
a person.
Oh, a person.
And that's connected to the idea of the resurrection of the dead.
Mhm.
So that is, but the other thing is, once you get beyond space and time, which a disembodied soul would do, there's no time.
Right.
So it's not spending a long time.
Yeah.
So that's another aspect of what you were talking about.
Well, was the risen Jesus a disembodied soul or a re-embodied soul?
the way Corinthians 15 talks about it is a transformed body.
Uh,
Mhm.
Yeah, transformed. Tom, I'm kind of with you when it comes to agnosticism and saying, I will find out.
Yeah,
And I don't know
Yeah.
how I
Our-
can
our-
find out now.
our faith
So, oh.
seems to be that it is, and that we have a destiny beyond this life. But to go farther than that, our faith really doesn't seem to say anything except in terms of union or non-union with God. But to
Uh,
say what it's like, our faith really doesn't say much.
N.T. Wright has a book on this. I can't think of the name of it, nor have I read it.
If it's surprised by hope, I
Perhaps.
did read it and I was very, very impressed with it.
My impression was he sort of says we're not conscious from when we die till the general resurrection. I don't remember if that's,
Yeah.
is that right, Tom?
Maybe it wasn't the same book.
But I know of others, excuse me.
Go
Go
ahead.
ahead.
Paul.
Go ahead, Fred.
What I know from others of his books is that he, although he treats those matters from the point of view of scripture, he doesn't want to really go beyond the scripture
Mhm.
and speculate what for him he would think of as speculation. But that goes for all kinds of developments of theology. He's giving you what he believes scriptures teach, and that's rich, and that's a full vocation for him. And we're thank God he is one, because he's such a good one. But he sets limits to his own competence, I think.
Mhm.
But that's another reason for liking him
Mhm.
Yeah.
and from going off.
A good authority.
So
Yes.
I'll put my hand down.
Okay, I'm going to have to say adios, put my hand down also.
Yeah, it is
So-
12:05.
Yeah,
Have we come to a logical, natural breaking point?
Yes, thank you.
should we keep reading Quest and bringing up questions or?
Well, I'd not like to have to go beyond where we are now. I didn't get to, even get to the third or fourth pieces.
So the part 2 is what about sin? It's decline, right?
Right.
And part 3 is about redemption. So should we stick with nature,
Yeah, I think.
basically what we're talking about, and
Yeah,
not get into decline yet?
Yes. I think it's a good idea since Ned isn't there yet.
Well,
Nor am I.
Okay.
I
I'm
think,
declining. I'm declining all the time, but I haven't.
Yeah,
read
but
about
didn't,
it.
yeah, but didn't you already get it during these 2 hours?
Well,
no,
I got a lot of it. We had a funeral this week, and
Yeah. Yeah,
well, I'll try to get to through 4.
Okay.
But can we stay there? I mean, no, not get
Okay,
beyond.
well then let's keep plowing, and goodbye, George Farrick. You're waving.
yes, adios.
Adios.
adios, George.
Okay.
God bless.
And shall we say mutually adios?
yes,
Adios.
All right.
Adios.
Take care. God bless you.
I'm the lead West.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks.
Till next
Thank
week.
you, guys. Thank you, Fred.
I
Naj?
will end the